I'm not going to be terribly formal. I got a lot of material that I hope I can cover between now and noon, and I'll leave lots of time at the end for questions if you'd like. But I'm also not averse to taking questions in the middle. It's not like once I get momentum going, don't stop me because I'm rolling downhill. So if there's something that I'm covering that I'm not making clear enough, by all means stop and ask a question. I don't mind that at all. About 8 years ago, I gave a talk on property rights in Toronto, and before I gave it, I phoned up a friend of mine named Glenn Fox, who's an economist at Guelph University and an expert on property rights. And I said, what do you think the state of property rights are in Canada? And he said, well, before you start talking about property rights, you have to ask yourself, what kind of property rights are you talking about? And they said, what kind? I mean, I'm talking about real property rights, like property rights. Everybody knows what property rights are. He said, no, what kind? And it reminded me of a scene in a Woody Allen movie called Manhattan, where Woody Allen, surprisingly, is playing a neurotic New York Jewish writer. And he overhears a woman at a party saying, I finally had an orgasm, but my doctor told me it's the wrong kind. To which Allen responds, you had the wrong kind? He said, I've never had the wrong kind. Every orgasm I've had has always been exactly the right kind. And that's how I feel about property rights. I don't care what kind of property rights we're talking about. Every kind of property rights is the right kind. But Glenn made a very important point. And to start off what I'm going to talk about this morning, I want to make the same point. He said that there are legal and economic property rights, and then there are political property rights. In Canada, we have, for the most part, reasonably solid economic property rights. We're kind of slipping on the legal property rights, but we no longer understand, for the most part, up to the highest levels of government, political property rights. And political property rights are, in my mind, the very foundation upon which individual liberty is founded. And so you have an awful lot of people who will say, oh, no, we can't have property rights because property rights are only for the rich. But I think you don't understand the concept of what property rights were initially put in place, why they were initially put in place. Because if you have the right, the property right to the fruits of your labor, or the creativity of your mind, because those are your property, or even property rights to your body, then there are certain things that government cannot do to you. Having political property rights necessarily limit government. Even if you don't have property, the right to somehow acquire property in the future limits what government can dictate to you, how it can regulate your life. And that is an assurance of personal liberty. So that's why I suggest that property rights, the political kind of property rights, are the foundation of individual liberty. Because if you don't have them, there isn't a bulwark that protects you against intrusion by government. Or more importantly nowadays, I think, by the tyranny of the majority. A colleague of mine named David Frum, who some of you may remember before he disappeared into the recesses of Washington, D.C., once talked about democracy and how democracy wasn't actually as simple as most people think it is. He said he was walking by a playground at one point and saw a group of 4- and 5-year-olds being asked by their kindergarten teacher what they wanted to do next. And she had given them 2 options and they were voting on it. He said that shows you how deeply entrenched in our culture, not every other culture, but our culture, the idea of democracy is, because little 4- and 5-year-olds felt that they were entitled to express their preference, but they also intrinsically understood that if they weren't in the majority, they would have to honor the choice that was made by the majority. And that's all well and good, except that we have now instilled that in people in our culture to such an extent that they think that whenever the majority votes for something, the majority rules. That's not the concept, that's not the Western concept of democracy at all. The Western concept of democracy is limited democracy. Those issues that must be taken out of the private sphere and put in the public sphere are to be voted on with the majority ruling. But as many issues as possible must be kept in the private sphere. That was the Western concept of democracy. It's interesting, I have a quote from Blackstone, and I don't want to get this wrong. William Blackstone, of course, wrote Commentaries on the Laws of England, which is probably still, although it's a little bit dense to read, probably still the greatest understanding of free people's rights and how to ensure them that I've read. And so this comes from the 1700s. It says, the principal aim of society must be to protect individuals in the enjoyment of their absolute rights. I think it would be very hard-pressed to find an academic writing from any of North America's law schools, or a political leader from any party, with the possible exception of Ron Paul or Rand Paul in the United States, who would understand what that meant. There are a few. I mean, there are some constitutional experts. I think Charles Krauthammer, who writes for the Washington Post, would probably understand that. John Robson, on a good day, understands that. But it is not a commonly held view anymore that government's role and society's role, so broader than government, society's role is to protect individual rights as much as possible. I mean, you could stop people on the street and they'd say, oh, we have more human rights now than ever before because we have human rights commissions. That goes actually to what I would call sort of a civil law or a French understanding that rights emanate from authority, that you have only as many rights as those people in authority are prepared to give you. And occasionally the people in authority understand that they may trammel your rights, so they establish another authority, which has authority from them, whose job it is to protect your rights. But no right exists that isn't recognized by the authority or the authority's authority for protecting human rights. That's why property rights to me are so important, because they are to exist above and beyond government to protect individuals from the excesses not of bad, mean racists or awful employers who won't let you wear your nose ring and your ponytails to work, but to protect you against government. There has been no threat to individual liberty greater than government, ever. In 1215, when the barons forced the king at Runnymede to sign the Magna Carta, it was because government was threatening what they saw as their individual liberties, and it's been a fight against that ever since. Government is not the source of liberty. But I guarantee you, if you go out on the street and talk even to well-educated people, and you ask them, who's the best guardian of individual liberty? They'll say, oh, a good progressive government. No. William Buckley used to say that the best government is that government that governs least. That's also the government that best understands individual liberty. Government did not exist before people. And we all came to it and said, oh my gosh, now that we're here, you have somebody you can regulate. Government's a necessary evil. And that's why I stress so strongly the political property rights and that concept of individual liberty. So Blackstone had what he considered these 3 absolute rights and then 5 auxiliary rights. And he said the 3 absolute rights, which are basically personal security, and it's interesting, he listed that one first. Personal security, which included the absolute right to self-defense, up to and including killing people who came on your property without your invitation. Even an agent of the king. In fact, Blackstone writes about this. You had the right to kill an agent of the king who showed up at night. So that was slightly different than just a regular burglar. Burglar showed up in the middle of the afternoon, you could off him. But you could kill an agent of the king who showed up at night uninvited. That was how absolute the right to self-protection, to personal security was. Then you had the right to personal liberty, which was freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of action. And the third absolute right was the right to private property. And Blackstone said, the first two cannot exist without the third. You had to have absolute right to personal property. I mean, there's an old famous Burke quote, which some of you probably will remember better than I do. I'm going to get it wrong. But even the humblest cottage, although the wind may blow through it and rattle the shingles, cannot be entered by an agent of the king except with the express invitation of the person who owns it. Queen Victoria once said she would not step over the threshold of the humblest cottage in her realm lest the person inside invited her to come in. Now I'm going to get into, in a little while, what I call the High River gun grab. There was absolutely no respect for the threshold of the humblest home or the most expensive home in High River, Alberta, when the Mounties decided they wanted all the guns. We'll get into that in a little while. I'm going to use two big examples of this in a minute or two. There's 100 examples of what I'm talking about. The modern misunderstanding of property rights by governments. Well, yeah, Tom.
Before you get into the examples, could you clarify for me what you mean by political property rights? Like could you enumerate what your understanding of them is and how they differ from what you call economic and legal property rights? Because I don't know really what you mean by political property rights.
Let's start with an example of what I mean of economic and legal property rights. If I buy a horse statue with a clock in its belly from the shopping channel, you may question my taste, but the instant my credit card has been approved, I have a demonstrable right to that property. And I have no doubt that I could go to any court in Canada and it would protect me against the evil villains who run the shopping channel, and I would have that lovely piece of home artifact promptly. But for instance, when the Alberta government decided that it wanted to act as the downfield blocker for power transmission companies, and it was going to take away rural residents' rights to object to power transmission lines being built across their property. It's also a legal right, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond the very fact that they would contemplate taking away, limiting the legal right of Canadian landowners, Alberta landowners, to prevent their property from being used for a purpose they didn't agree with or didn't want to participate in. Shows that on a political level there isn't an understanding anymore of what property rights were meant to do. So the legal understanding is that, if you and I enter into a contract and one of us fails to live up to it, we can seek remedy from the courts. But the very fact that there's no concept anymore of limited government held in check by the sanctity of private property is, to me, a political property.
So are things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to vote, are these what you mean by political property rights?
No. I do mean a more traditional understanding of property, but those are, again, like Blackstone's absolute rights. I mean, the freedom of vote is the right to personal liberty. It's separate from property. But unless you can say, at the boundary of this yard, the government has limited power, then eventually they'll find a way to take away your political liberties too. They'll restrict your movement, they'll restrict your speech, their thought. To me, property rights are an understanding that individuals are paramount to government, and that government's intrusion on individual freedoms has to involve due process, and it has to be extremely limited. But for 80 years now in Canada, we've had laws that have. This is not something really, really new. Since the 1920s and 30s, there have been laws in Canada that said governments, for instance, don't have to pay you compensation if they take your private property, so long as in the law that enables them to take your property, they clearly state that compensation is not required. So back in 1998, when the federal government, by stroke of pen, outlawed 58% of all of the handguns in the country, they paid no compensation for that because they put into the legislation that enabled them to outlaw short-barreled handguns. They put in a clause that said no compensation is to be paid. And courts, not just new courts, not just courts since the Charter, courts in Canada have been upholding this now for almost 80 years. It's progressed, it's gotten worse. I think initially the courts that first said that was okay would be appalled by how far that's been applied these days. But to me, it was very natural progression that if you let that power in a crack, eventually it's going to kick the entire door down. Derek?
So just what I'm taking away from this, the difference between the two kinds of property rights is the violator. Is government violating your property rights, or is it another individual or business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a common thread in that. Certainly, and so government is upset when another individual or a company violates your property rights. They don't have any of the same qualms about doing it themselves, and so I do think that's good. I mean, I think it's an understanding by the political culture in a country that individuals are sovereign, and unless you have fairly fairly stern property rights, then the government's ability to regulate your life is almost limitless. So anyway, there are lots of examples, right? That you could look at Quebec sign laws as an intrusion on property rights. You know, if you want to operate a business solely in Urdu, what business is it of the government? It may be the business of your clients. They may decide that since they don't speak Urdu, they're not coming in to buy whatever it is that you're selling, and you go out of business. Fine, that's a free will decision between you and your customer. But to say that all signs must be predominantly French and that other languages must only be X percentage the same, I mean, that is a government trampling on a property right. Endangered Species Acts are infamous for regulating out of existence property rights over entire swaths of land because a snail darter or a burrowing owl or a speckled trout has been found, and you as a property owner now are responsible for being the guardian of what a bureaucrat has decided is an endangered species. That's where the 3 S's come from: shoot, shovel, and shut up. Smoking bans in bars are an example of taking away property rights. Nobody forces you to go into a bar. I mean, it becomes a public place only because the entrepreneur invites the public in to have a drink and maybe some, questionable finger food. But that doesn't mean that the government has any obligation to step in between the bar owner and his or her patrons to determine whether they want to allow smoking inside. If you know smoking is going on inside and you object to smoking, don't go in. That would be what would happen if there were property rights. But again, now the government thinks there's a public good in improving the health of bar patrons by forbidding smoking to go on inside what is essentially a private business. Wind turbines. If you're from Ontario in particular, this is a touchy issue because the government, again, like power transmission lines in Alberta, the Ontario provincial government basically outlawed the ability of landowners to stand up and resist the erection of wind turbines for power generation on their property. Those are things that a generation ago, or at least certainly 2 generations ago, governments would never have conceived to do. But we now have lost the concept of property rights. And you hear people all the time, well-educated, intelligent, young, old, doesn't matter, saying property rights are only for the rich. But if government can limit how people with property use that property, they are also by extension limiting how people who don't have property can acquire property. You increase the transaction cost of buying property if you regulate it. If you restrict its use, you restrict how people can acquire it. And so property rights affect not just people who have a lot of property, they affect everyone. Now, I would suggest that you have property rights over your body. That would mean then if you decided that you wanted to kill yourself, well, then that's your decision because you're using your property. I may suggest to you that you not consider euthanasia. It may be in my belief system the wrong thing to do. It might be immoral, and to me it is. But that's between you and your God, or you and I as free citizens talking to one another and expressing our opinions. It's got nothing to do with the government. So there's lots of examples I could use, but I want to use 2. And I want to get into the first one, which is, it's called CPR versus Vancouver. For most of the 20th century, the Canadian Pacific Railroad operated a rail line from False Creek in Vancouver, one of the most expensive real estate areas in North America. From False Creek down to Steveston, which is in Richmond, basically. They used to bring an awful lot of freight from the docks into downtown Vancouver. Now, as it became more economically beneficial to Vancouverites to build skyscrapers than to run warehouses, the need for moving goods up and down this rail line dwindled. Traffic dwindled. By 1999, the CPR had basically abandoned the line as a rail line. They weren't running trains up and down anymore, and that was nice because it's only 36 feet wide. And residential buildings have been constructed on either side. So, it's kind of annoying to the people who live that close, but the rail line had been there since 1902, before there were residences out that far in Vancouver. And so it was kind of grandfathered. In the early 2000s, the city of Vancouver decided this is a lovely chunk of land through a very nice set of neighborhoods in the west, at the west end of Vancouver. We would like to keep this in our back pocket in case we either want to build light rapid transit along there, because there's already a track there. Well, maybe we could upgrade the track, we could run transit. Or maybe we would just decide that this is going to be green space with some bike paths and some community gardens. There were already an awful lot of people from the neighboring communities who were planting gardens on the right-of-way during the summer.
Trespassing.
Yeah, but the CPR was not enforcing its property rights there. So courts will tell you if you don't enforce your claim to property, eventually you can lose that property, at least lose the control of that property. So we'll get into what the CPR did with the community gardens this summer, but anyway, so this is the early 2000s. Vancouver decides it wants this piece of land kept for its future uses, not for CPR's future uses. CPR says, okay, fine, buy it. If we develop this for commercial and residential use, we estimate, at that time, they estimated the value of the land would be $200 million. Give us $200 million, it can be yours. And you can do with it whatever you wish. Well, the city of Vancouver said, oh, no. We don't want to spend $200 million. So CPR says, well, and ask the province or the feds. Maybe they'll buy it for you. Nope, neither one of them would buy it either. They didn't want to spend $200 million. Now it's valued at about $400 million. But this was a little more than 10 years ago. $200 million. So the city of Vancouver said, we're going to pass an amendment to the land use bylaw that says you may own this, but it may only be used for parks or for a rail line. So CPR goes to court, and in 2006 the Supreme Court of Canada, so it wins at the trial level, it loses at the BC appeal level, and it loses at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says no, this is a public good, and so the city of Vancouver is within its rights as the defender of the public good in Vancouver to restrict your use of this property unless you're going to use it for your initial purpose, which was to run trains back and forth. So since 2006, the city of Vancouver and the railroad have been going back and forth over just exactly who's going to pay for what and what this is going to be used for. CPR gets legal advice this summer that if it doesn't start using the land soon and enforcing its ownership of the land, that it runs the risk, it's not certainty, but it runs the risk that some future court will say, you're not using it for what you had it for, so therefore, too bad, you lose it. So they announced in what is now the middle of a mayoral election in Vancouver, there'll be an election, I think it's November 15th is the election date. They said, well, we're going to send out some people to cut down all the bushes that have grown up along the route, 11 kilometers inside the city of Vancouver. We're going to trim it all back, and we're going to rip up all the community gardens, so your organic kale is gone. Your pesticide-free zone, which is on our property, is going to be torn up by the roots because we think maybe as early as October we're going to start running trains again. I mean, I don't know what they were going to use the trains for. I assume they'd just take a couple of old trains and run them back and forth once or twice a day just to prove that they have trains and they can do it. In all the coverage I've read and in all the people I've talked to from CPR and city government in Vancouver, no one has ever suggested what in hell these trains would ever be used for, because there is no way, well, there is a way. Apparently there is a spur that goes around under a covered bridge or whatever, not like the New England covered bridge, but a traffic bridge. There's a line that could be used to get some goods from down by the water over to warehouses in the False Creek Flats, but no one ever believed that was ever going to happen. So no one knew what the CPR was thinking it would take on these trains. But they said, okay, fine, if you are not going to buy this from us at anywhere close to the market value that we think is the market value, and it's got to be the market value as we determine because we're the landowner, you cannot regulate out of existence our right to build housing along here if we think we want to. You can't simply say it's worth $8 million. That was the last valuation by the city, was it's $8 million because it's only parkland. But you were the ones who passed the bylaw that made it parkland. I mean, this is how the concept of property rights escapes modern politicians, many modern politicians. So as recently as 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago now, the city of Vancouver filed a notice of motion trying to get an injunction against and tried to get an injunction to stop CPR from running trains until their lawsuit could go ahead. Claiming that in law and in practice this was no longer a rail line, and so therefore not even its use for running trains should be allowed. It should only be for parks. Or maybe if the city decided later it wanted to develop it for housing, it could do that, but the CPR couldn't. I mean, it's atrocious. It absolutely baffles me how we have gotten to this point. where the city simply decides what you can use your property for, and if you don't like it, they will regulate your use out of existence and then say, yes, but how could you possibly ask for $400 million when it's only useful as park space? You were the goofballs who made it park space. So this is sort of circular thinking that is almost impenetrable in the property rights debate. And the fact that we've gotten that much intellectually and culturally means it is going to be a long, hard fight to get back to even a semblance of the property rights as understood by Blackstone. Blackstone, in the introduction to his commentary, said, yes, it is possible to encroach on individual property rights for the common good. But the highest common good is the maximization of individual property rights. So therefore, you can't expropriate land for a road because you're diminishing the highest possible common good, which is the maximization of individual. And I guarantee you, if you go to most legal scholars now or to lots of our politicians, they'll say, oh yes, we are the epitome of human intellectual evolution. No one has understood freedom and independence as much as we do now. We have all of these commissions that we've implemented and paid hundreds of millions of dollars to protect those very freedoms that we now know so much better. I guarantee you that initially, the Bill of Rights era in England through to beyond Blackstone's time, when you have Locke, and then Blackstone and Mills and people like, they understood far more the value of property rights than most modern great thinkers do. When you look at the American Revolutionary period, the founding period, they understood far better than we do because their real liberties were under threat. In a general sense, our liberties are not under threat to the same level that they were when you had a dictatorial king, or you were just fought a revolution to be rid of the Brits. When people had been imprisoned wrongly for speaking out against the king, they were tangible then.
Are there any limits, though, in terms of, for example, can one person prevent like there's this big open pit mine near my hometown, and this one holdout guy, eventually they had to kick him out. But is that reasonable? Because of his property rights, you should be able to stop $1 billion project?
It's his property. The trick there is that, of course, for the most part, in Western democracies, the subsurface rights don't belong to the surface rights holder. And so, unless you have, and hair on him if he does, unless you have the subsurface rights to the mineral rights to underneath your property,
Open pit mine, they had to move everyone. So
but, we have a summer place not far from the Sundance power plant in Wabamun, Alberta, and same thing there. Farms that have been in the same family for 4 generations were wiped out because the power company needed to mine the coal. I would say that you should have to mine around properties that people don't want to sell. That's how far property rights should go. The trick becomes when governments, largely in the 20s and 30s, legislated for subsurface rights. They said, well, you didn't know that there was stuff under your land, so you didn't have the right to that property. Therefore, you now have to, as the surface rights holder, negotiate with the owner of the subsurface rights for reasonable access to what they own underneath your property. Even that, though, increasingly, the tie goes to the subsurface rights holder, and then people do get moved away because the government has decided on open pit mining. Probably one of the best examples of that kind of action is called Kelo, the Kelo decision in Connecticut. There were a bunch of people who had lived along an ugly stretch, what was once an ugly stretch of river in New London, Connecticut. And they had small houses, old houses, not fancy houses in any way, which the city decided it wanted to expropriate to give to a pharmaceutical company that was going to build its headquarters right along the river. Because now, you can go to any community and there are places that overlook ravines or that are built along rivers, which used to be undesirable neighborhoods. But as our concept of what's desirable has changed, these have become valuable property. Well, I think there were 8 property owners in New London, Connecticut, did not want to move. In some cases, the houses had been in the family for 3 generations. They loved living along the river, or they were too old to want to move somewhere new. They didn't care. They didn't care what the city wanted to use it for. The city didn't actually want to use it. The city was expropriating it to give it to the pharmaceutical company. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in a 5-4 decision, decided that that was a public good, that the private company's use of this land was a greater public good than the homeowner's use of this land, and it allowed the expropriation. It's appalling that a city government would get so wrapped up in this notion, development at all costs, that individual property rights holders' rights the individual property owners' rights are trampled. There.
2 weeks into the job, our government seems to have done a very extensive study on the feasibility of a dry reservoir west of Calgary here. Because you can decide that in 2 weeks. And there are people in the Springbank area, some very nice properties, very old farms, who are probably thinking that at some point, as Calgary will eventually link up with Canmore, that their property is going to be worth something.
Yeah.
And
it's going to be a while before Canada.
well, yeah, but it's not long before Springbank. And let's just pretend for a moment that they've actually done a feasibility study, which they haven't, and that this is a good idea, that this reservoir is actually going to save Calgary from the next big flood. There's a very clear public good here, but there's 10 farms in the meantime. Do you think the government has a right to clear them out?
No, I don't. And you would find out what the real value of that property is by the government having to negotiate in good faith with each and every one of those landowners to buy up their property. And if you got nervous and a little bit wet and you sold early, 2 years later when your neighbor sells less property for 3 times as much money because he's the last holdout, you're going to be kicking yourself. But tough luck.
Especially, say an old family farm that's been in the family for, 4 generations plus. So people might just not have a price. They're just not interested in selling. And if it holds up a reservoir that could save billions of dollars property damage to Calgary.
Good for them.
You don't think there's
No, I
expropriate?
used to read this book to our kids, and it was from the Little Miss and Mr. series. They're Mr. Grumpy and Mr. Happy and Mr. Sneezy or whatever it was. And Mr. Grumpy was in his own garden. He's a miserable SOB, but he was in his own garden being miserable about the world. And Mr. Happy comes in uninvited. I might add he should perhaps get a hoe in the head, but he comes in uninvited and says to Mr. Grumpy, "It's not good to be grumpy, you have to be happy." No, I always said to the kids, no, I'm with Mr. Grumpy. I may actually be a Mr. Grumpy, I don't know, but I'm with Mr. Grumpy. He's on his own property. If he doesn't want to be happy, he doesn't have to be happy. And so if I put you, there's a price, everybody has a price. And at some point it becomes ridiculous to hold out. And that farmer who wants to keep the 4-generation farm, his wife is going to start putting pressure on him at some point when they get up around the 10 times what the market value is. But they should be able to hold out for as long as they want. Find some other way to handle a flood. Just because this is the simplest and most obvious way of doing it, tough luck. Here and then here.
But wouldn't you say that what government does a lot of times is, for example, in this decision you just noted, and also in this example with the reservoir, they're picking winners and losers.
Yep.
They're giving preference to his property rights over this guy's property rights, and they're creating an uneven playing field, and they do it all the time.
They do.
The other thing is, you're ignoring the fact that there are alternatives. How about dredge all these creeks that are full of sediment and everything that are causing the flood? So this is the issue where government starts to meddle and do things that infringe on other people's property rights, that they're picking winners and
And
losers.
I'm not particularly confident that governments are good at flood prevention anyway,
No,
because the dikes in New Orleans that were breached were not there by nature. They were there because the Army Corps of Engineers had built them there, and they were the ones that was what, to prevent flooding. And if you remember, they didn't breach when the storm hit. The storm did not cause the flooding. The backwash from the lake overran the dikes that the government had built to prevent flooding, and that's what caused the flooding in New Orleans. So whatever great scheme there is for preventing the flooding, that's just a political decision. You can get most people saying, I don't ever want my house flooded again. Do whatever you have to, to stop it, including damaged property rights that at some point those very same people who are pleading for a solution might want. And then when they go to use them, they're not there. Rob.
I was going to make just a similar point that the Springbank Dam issue is clouded by the fact that there are better locations further upriver of Redwood Meadows and Bragg Creek on public land that the government could use, but for, I believe, political reasons, they've decided to do something in Springbank. So, yes, it's a property rights issue, but it's also it's convoluted by a wrong decision, picking the wrong place, the wrong site in the first place.
Yeah, that I'm sure happens too. John.
The power to take property, which has existed from time immemorial, exists to solve three problems: free riders, holdouts, and transaction costs. And you can't make a rule that government can only do this if it's completely wise, because nothing, including property rights, can make it completely wise. What you can do, though, is insist that they provide compensation so that the cost of the government decision, whether wise or foolish, does not fall unfairly on a certain person. But your farmer who treasures the old homestead, if he's allowed to demand his own price for it, then you haven't solved the holdup problem. So it must be done at fair market price, and nobody's going to be completely happy. But if the power is to be used at all, it has to be able to be used even if the government's decision is less than ideal, and it has to be involving market prices. Otherwise you grant the takings power with one hand and deny it with the other. But sometimes you do need takings. You need to build a road, right? You can't let the guy who says, oh, it's sentimental value, get $1 billion for 1 acre of land.
If he can convince the government to give him $1 billion, I'm all
Yeah, but
for
the
it.
government should take, what is the average sale price of this kind of land in this area?
No.
So,
The market price is what the seller and the buyer agreed to.
yeah, but then you haven't solved the holdup problem.
I know, the holdouts are not a problem.
There's nothing to get done, which means
Okay.
which means you don't have the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution, because it says the government can take property for public use, and you're saying it can't.
Yeah, I would say that it should. Mhm. Yep. So that gets us to another flood. June. Night of June 20th, morning of June 21st last year, all hell breaks loose. There's a very too rapid melt of the excessive snow cover, exacerbated by 200 millimeters of rain in the foothills, and the Highwood River comes roaring out of the Rockies and inundates High River. Now, why is High River called High River?
I've never heard that.
Exactly. It floods periodically. But this is a big flood. This is as bad as most people can remember. Downtown, which is the area of town that floods most frequently, it's not that excessive. I mean, it's bad. There are still businesses that haven't recovered from it. I'm not suggesting that it was trivial. But it was not unique in its destructiveness necessarily. A couple of days later, the water in downtown has receded for the most part. But for reasons that don't bear going into and aren't entirely clear right now, a new neighborhood in the northeast section of High River gets back flooded. So the water goes down the river. It's prevented from flowing out largely because the rate of flow is just so huge. And this water comes back into a neighborhood that should never ever get flooded. Like, it's not, geographically, there's no reason it floods, but it did because there was just so much water. For the next 3 days, it's pretty frantic. First 24 hours are basically a panic. Mounties and other first responders, by the 22nd, also the armed forces, are rushing around town. And we get conflicting numbers on how many people were saved. It's either 31 or 38. It depends on a couple of definitions of words, which I won't get into right now. In one report, 31 people were saved. In the other, 38 people were escorted out of town. Now, escorted out of town sounds like a different thing to me than saved. But nonetheless, somewhere under 40 people in the first 24 hours, plucked off their roofs by Army helicopters, lifted out by pontoon boats, whatever. I mean, it's a bad time. And I doubt very much that there are many of us who would resent the Mounties going into homes, making sure that there aren't people trapped under debris, cowering in a corner watching the rising flood waters and unsure of how to get out because the water in the street is running faster than it used to run in the river, and they don't, it's a bad situation. By June the 23rd, by the afternoon, 3:30 in the afternoon, both the Mounties and the armed forces send separate messages to their headquarters saying that, and this is a direct quote from the armed forces, the threat to life and limb has passed. The Mounties send a note that says, things are okay. There's still lots of the city, there's lots of the town that's flooded, but, things are pretty calm. We've been through 3,300 homes, and we think they're clear. A lot of people leave town. They're told that if they have left their homes empty, they should register with emergency services or with the Red Cross so that emergency crews know that they don't have to go into those homes to rescue anybody. Thousands of people register with either the provincial government or the Red Cross. Things get kind of testy. As you may remember from watching some of the news coverage, there are people, Emil Blockland was the mayor, and he became quite infamous for his news conferences out on the highway outside of town. He gave no answers. The most famous one, he's standing there and he said, "We can't let you back into town until we have a hardware store that's working, and a gas station that's working, and a grocery store." You can see from where he's standing, because I stood there myself when we were filming a documentary for Sun News last year. You can see from where he was standing. You can look out to the northwest. You can see Okotoks. Okotoks is open. Everything's there. They got a Costco. They got gas stations. They got a big Home Depot or a Lowe's or something like that. And the people are saying that, "Emil, we can go to Okotoks. It's 5 minutes away. We don't need those things. Let us into our home." But things are quite testy. At one point, the RCMP asked the military to put labs at the entrances to town, light armored vehicles. And the military said, "You're out of your minds? We're not supposed to do law enforcement to begin with. We're not sure whether or not later on they get involved in some law enforcement. That's something that's unclear at the moment." But they had the good sense to say, imagine the optics of the Army putting vehicles at the entrances to town to keep citizens of Canada out of their homes. Are you out of your minds? And so, no, they didn't do that. But things get testier. On the evening of June the 23rd, Doug Griffiths, who was the municipal affairs minister at the time and is thankfully without a job in the current cabinet, he was also the emergency preparedness minister. He comes and he does a press conference in High River, after which a loyal member of the Conservative Party in the constituency of Highwood comes up to him and he says, "Look, Minister, if you guys don't do something to let people back in soon, I think they're going to rush the barriers." It was a warning, which Griffith later says to us, oh, I went to 31 communities during the flooding and I was never threatened anywhere but in High River. He wasn't threatened. A guy who was in the constituency association of his own party in that riding said to him, things are getting kind of testy, you better get people back into their homes. After that, so there's 700 forced entries of doors prior to the 23rd and 24th of June. Emergency's over, in any sense that any of us would understand. Legally, there's still a state of emergency. Okay, I get that. But in the sense of the real natural disaster, the real emergency is over. People are registering that their homes are empty, or they put X's on the doors to tell people like the Mounties or the fire department or that there's no one inside. From June the 24th until July the 10th, another 1,300 doors were kicked in. 600 firearms, somewhere closer to 700 firearms, are taken because they were in plain view, according to the Mounties, which according to them means that they were improperly stored. They weren't locked in a vault. Because as near as I can figure out, the Mounties are still using the 1995 definition of what safe storage is. You may remember, if you're a gun owner, I'm not, but I've covered this issue since the time of Allen Rock, that the initial definition of safe storage was you had to put your guns in a separate vault from your ammunition. And indeed, they should, if possible, be in two separate rooms. Now, through court rulings, if you've got a trigger lock on it and it's hidden away from plain view, there aren't many judges who are going to charge you with unsafe storage or convict you of unsafe storage. Legal precedent has moved on from the original definition, but it looks like the Mounties are still using the. We had one Mountie spokeswoman tell us, well, if our members are going into a closet and they find a gun, they move some clothing and they see a gun, then it's in plain view. Oh, I can guarantee you, if you got a stash of crystal meth in your house and the Mounties go in without a warrant and they move the clothing in your closet to find the stash stacked behind the shoe boxes, the judge is going to say, sorry, that's an illegal search. Kicking the evidence, and you got to drop the charge. So that's not anybody's definition of plain view that we understand. Locksmiths refused to go to homes with the Mounties because the Mounties didn't have warrants. They kicked in the doors instead. I have followed this story as closely as I've followed any other story in the last 18 months, and I can come to only one conclusion, and that is because of the testiness of High River residents who are being forbidden to go to their private homes, their private property, because of their testiness, and because of this one threat after a press conference, the Mounties decided that they had to take as many guns out of High River as they could possibly find. We know they were using police information computers to determine which homes were owned by people who had firearms licenses. Okay, that again, it becomes a targeted search. You have to have a warrant for that. If you think that there's a gun that's a danger to the public safety in a home, you know that that homeowner has a gun owner's license, you have to go to a judge and you have to say, Your Honor, my lord, my lady, we need a warrant. Didn't do that. This is, even if it wasn't a gun issue, even if it turns out that they weren't actually trying to strip the town of guns, some of their thinking is so absolutely faulty, it baffles me. So after the crisis has ended, they kick down 1,300 additional doors. They leave 1,900 homes in High River with the doors off the hinges in the name of keeping the community safe. So I love the wisdom of ordinary people. There's a big meeting held in High River Town Hall at the high school last September. Guy I never did know his name, stands up and he says, please explain. He says this to the sergeant in charge of the detachment. in High River, please explain to me how my property is safer with the door kicked down and no one patrolling the streets than it would have been if you hadn't gone into my house to check to see if it was safe. The whole point that public safety, as defined by the Mounties, superseded any kind of respect for private property shows, I think, again, just how far we've gotten away from the concept of property rights in Canada and how much that threatens individual liberties. My wife, who's not a crazy mouth-breathing radical on property rights like I am, we're driving by, just by coincidence. We happened to be driving past High River on the highway on the day that the Mounties announced they had seized hundreds of guns. And it was their word. That was their word. When they got burned in public opinion and in the press, they started taking into custody for safekeeping. But initially they said, we've seized hundreds of guns. As though we would all rally around that and say, isn't that a right thing for Mounties to do? So my wife, who's not this property rights lunatic like I am, says to me, what did they just say on the radio? I said, the Mounties just said that they have gone into hundreds of homes in High River and taken guns. Now later on they also said, oh, sometimes we were taking valuables too for safekeeping. And that's not what they said at the initial press conference. You can tell what people think is important by their first impression that they leave. And their first impression was they were taking only guns and they were seizing them. They were not trying to do a public good by bundling them up and putting them in the lockup so that bad people couldn't get their hands on them. They thought the people who'd left them in their closets were the bad people. There's one guy whose home was in an unaffected part of High River. Gas is still on, power's still on, water's still running, no flood damage. Mounties went to his house 3 times. On the third trip, they found 2 antique long guns behind boxes in the furnace room. Didn't find them the first 2 times they went looking, but on the third time they didn't have a warrant. It was in an unaffected part of town. They couldn't have been looking for survivors. In some cases, in affected parts, they went into people's sock drawers. You're not looking for a survivor. You might be looking for a handgun, but you're not looking, grandma's not pulled herself into her unmentionables drawer because she's afraid of the rising waters. It became, I just think that there are too many people, Mounties and otherwise, who are obsessed with the public good, public safety, public, over private property rights. And when that starts to happen, then it's a threat to ordinary law-abiding citizens and their rights.